American woman ever to hold the title of justice. Think about the impact that will have on our democracy. Untold millions of kids will open textbooks and see pictures of Justice Jackson among the highest ranks of our public figures. How many millions of kids in generations past could have benefited from such a role model? How many would-be justices, lawyers, doctors, generals, business people have been lost to history precisely because their history books had few, if any, role models that they could relate to? We certainly have a long way to go on the road to true justice, but by confirming Judge Jackson today, we are taking a bold step forward towards reaching the full realization of our country's promise. We will make it far more likely that girls across America will feel precisely what Judge Jackson felt herself when she was a kid. Nobody can stop me. I can do this too. I am brilliant too. I belong too. For all these reasons, increasing the diversity of the court has been one of my highest priorities and one of the highest priorities of our Senate Democratic majority, of whom I am so proud. Justice Jackson is the most important example, but we've been working on this for over a year. Of the 58 Senate-confirmed federal judges since we took the majority, 3/4 have been women. 2/3 have been people of color. And it's not just racial and gender diversity that matters. We have strived to lift up judges that bring diversity through their experience. More public defenders in our courts, more civil rights lawyers, more election lawyers. When Americans of all walks of life come before the court, they should have confidence that those who don the robes have the ability to walk in their own shoes, to see and understand their side of the story, and then apply the law properly according to the facts. One judge at a time, one judge at a time, this majority is expanding the possibility of who merits consideration to the bench. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my Republican colleagues who joined us on this occasion over the year to achieve this goal. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Durbin for beautifully executing this nomination process. It was equal parts fair, thorough, and expeditious. No easy feat in this modern Senate. I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. You were just fabulous, every one of you, for your respectful and insightful examination of the judge's record. And I want to thank my Republican colleagues who chose to take this process seriously, no matter which side you voted on. The President sent us an impressive nominee. She merited a robust and thoughtful and lively examination. I thank the members who did it precisely that. In short, Madam President, this is one of the great moments of American history. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, in most states you had to be a white, male, Protestant landowner to be considered part of American society. So from the get-go, generations of Americans have sought to establish the United States as a full democracy. We fought a bloody civil war to end slavery. Women organized and reached for the ballot. The civil rights movement brought an end to the vicious segregation of the mid-20th century. And today, we are taking a giant, bold, and important step on the well-trodden path to fulfilling our country's founding promise. This is a great moment for Judge Jackson, but it is even a greater moment for America as we rise to a more perfect union. I thank my colleagues for their work, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District of Columbia to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is, is there a sufficient second? There is, and certainly appears to be, a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Booker. Yes. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Haggerty. No. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hassan. Aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven. No. Mr. Hoven, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane. Aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Kelly. Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Marshall. No. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran voted in the negative. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mrs. Murray. Aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Romney? Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen? Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Rounds? Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby, no. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Warnock? Mr. Warnock, aye. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Madam President, very happily, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.